Today we'll be going through many of the new features in 5.2. I'm aware that some of you aren't familiar with ABACUS, so I'll try to keep it high level and give the background where necessary. But certainly if you would like more of a tailored intro if you are new to ABACUS, we do have other sessions for that, or we'd be happy to put together a tailored demonstration for you to suit your needs. Before we get stuck into 5.2, I'll just give a little bit of background about Avolution and ABACUS and where we come from. We are one of the leading enterprise architecture tool providers in the market today. We have reached out to over 2,000 companies in about 100 different countries around the world. We currently have 6 offices globally. I'm actually based at the moment in the Sydney, Australia office. But I also spend a lot of time over in the US, in Northern Virginia. And then we also have offices in Canada, London, Singapore, and Dubai. We are a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant and the Forrester Wave. We are very highly regarded by the analysts across the industry. And one thing I think that's particularly strong for us is our showing in Gartner's Peer Insight reviews. Those are reviews that are left by customers using different tools. And in the EA sector, we are actually leading that at the moment with 4.7 out of 5 as our average rating. And we are one of the most heavily rated tools out there. So that's something that you can actually Google and find out more on if you're interested. But we've come a long way since we started as a spin-off company from the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. And over the last 15 years, we've built on the practice that we've had, haven't changed our philosophy, and we've found that it's worked very well for a lot of different organizations. So that brings us to ABACUS, the product itself. A lot of people ask me in 30 seconds, what is it that we do? And essentially what we do is, as a company, we look at the people, processes, and technology across organizations and look at ways that you can identify streamlining and efficiencies and identify areas that can be improved. And so we do that by allowing you to model information very quickly, perform very detailed analysis, and then present that to a variety of stakeholders. So part of that is helping people to import data using SharePoint, Excel, and various other sources that they're familiar with. Once they get the data in, they can then model that using a drag and drop interface, which is very intuitive. The analysis can be run with various algorithms built into ABACUS, or you can even bring your own algorithm. Then you can start to build roadmaps and look at different scenarios that you have and plan for the future, find out where the different paths are going to take you. And once you've done that, you can build up rich visuals and present that to different stakeholders through dashboards and diagrams and various other reports. Road mapping is a very big part of what we do in ABACUS. So there's 4 different types of roadmaps that we support. And they essentially answer the 4 fundamental questions behind a roadmap. And that is, what is it that we're going to do? When are we going to do it? How is that going to impact other areas? And why is it that we want to pursue one particular strategy over another? So as for 5.2, it builds on obviously the existing ABACUS toolset that we have. I'm going to outline 10 major features that go into the client for ABACUS today, but there are over 100 that go into that alone. There's also 5 major feature enhancements I'll talk about in ABACUS Intelligence, which is our dashboarding section. There's been a number of updates to ABACUS libraries. I'll just touch on some of those that are a bit more significant. So there's our own ABACUS library, as well as BPMN, BizBoc, and we also include the Australian Government Architecture Framework. That's very similar to the FIAF framework that's used in the US. We'll also, just quickly, I'll touch on that now, is we do also have an extra essentially module. It's something that's freely available to ABACUS users, and it allows you to support Active Directory authentication to external repositories. And so what that means is, if we are hosting your backend repository and you would like to have Active Directory authentication rather than just have a single username, password that people can share and what have you. That's something that we have a utility that can help with that. So please let us know if that's the case, and we'd be happy to help you set that up. And across the board, there's well over 100 new features and fixes that have gone into this release. So you'll see quite a lot of improvement. So just a quick overview of what these 10 items are that I'm going to cover today in the client. Firstly, there's an enhanced REST API that we support. That's in addition to our .NET API that we've always had that provides open access to the ABACUS object model. We also have the ability to support single sign-on for users that are using ABACUS Cloud. And that's based around Active Directory Federation services, though it will work with potentially third-party tools that support WS-Fed. There's thousands of those out there, so we haven't tested with all of them, but in theory, if they support WS-Fed, they should be able to work with our single sign-on stack that we have. We've also done a number of performance overhauls that help you to load your ABACUS file quickly and perform certain operations much more quickly. We've extended the inheritance subtypes that we implemented in 5.1 to be supported in Catalogues. So we'll look at what that looks like today. And I won't go through the other features just right now, but we'll cover them in detail as we go through the webinar. But various features covering matrices, catalogs, publisher, the report builder, and as well as BPMN and ArchiMate interchange formats and project scripts. So let's start with the REST API that we now have in ABACUS. We've always had, as I mentioned, the .NET API that provides complete access to the object model that's in ABACUS. We, of course, have a graph database on the back end. So if you aren't familiar with those, they essentially provide a much better way of being able to look at connections and relationships between components. So a lot of the queries that are possible with graph databases not really possible with relational databases. It's simply something that just takes too long. And so if you look at a lot of the e-commerce providers like Amazon and eBay, they use graph databases very heavily for that purpose. And so that's what we have on the back end with ABACUS, and having this REST API makes it very easy to query that from other applications. It is accessible through the abacus.server executable that's included with ABACUS. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a command line ABACUS. It's included with the installation package. You can install that on a server, and you can use that to automate scripts and various other things in ABACUS so you don't have to manually do them. Now, in this first release, it will be a read-only API. So it's just for querying data from ABACUS. We will be updating the API probably in version 6.1, which will be out next year, and that will provide the ability to then write back to ABACUS through that API. If you do need to write through the API right now, the .NET API does support that, so that is the best option at the moment. As for how it's structured, there's an example call there, and it uses the OData standard for the way that the queries are structured. So there's a number of different endpoints and things like all architectures, components, and so forth. And you can put in queries and filters that will bring down the data set to show exactly what you need. So if you're familiar with OData, it's a very intuitive way of expanding out your query, and it works very well with the structure that we have. I provided this webinar to the UK last night. One of the questions that came up was whether it was only HTTP. So it does actually support HTTPS as well. It's an extra step in configuration, but it is what we would recommend for deploying that. Now, the next feature I'll call out is the single sign-on capability for ABACUS Cloud. If you're familiar with ABACUS Cloud, you log in through a gateway, and that takes you through to the ABACUS Cloud server. What we do with single sign-on is we provide a dedicated gateway, which we call our authentication server. And so users log into that. It has a different URL than the standard public gateway that we use. And so with that, you can set it up so that it communicates with your Active Directory Federation Services environment, or if you're using a third-party tool that uses WSFed to connect out to that. And that will essentially look after the authentication aspect. So the user's passwords are automatically sent directly through to that server, so our gateway doesn't have to receive them. And if that all passes, then a token is sent back to our authentication gateway, and that then redirects you to the cloud server. We've implemented a number of performance overhauls in 5.2. So if you're working with enterprise server, you're performing updates and commits, they can now be completed without reloading the object model. And so what that means is that it doesn't have to close and reopen ABACUS every time you commit. And that makes a huge improvement with speed. That can mean that when you're working with ABACUS, you can actually save minutes at a time if you're working with a large model. So you'll notice that one straight away. Also, if you're a user that has no local changes to perform, then it doesn't trawl through all the change logs when you perform an update. It just jumps to the end and takes you to the current state. And if you've ever been away on vacation and left your ABACUS file with no changes and then came back, you'd find it takes a while to do an update the first time back. So that's no longer the case. You can enjoy your vacation and not worry about ABACUS taking several minutes to load when you first come back. The other thing that's improved significantly is the load time of all files. So generally it cuts the load time by about half, but some models the improvement is noticeably more. And so when you first load up ABACUS, you'll notice that you're able to get going and working much, much quicker. Now I mentioned that the subtypes was a feature that we implemented in the meta model in ABACUS 5.1. So ABACUS, of course, has a very flexible meta model. You can configure it directly through the UI. And we implemented the concept of inheritance, very similar to object-oriented paradigm, so that you can have types that inherit properties from supertypes. And that way it's much easier to maintain your meta model and keep it consistent. And what we've done now is we've extended that so that there's an extra option to include subtypes in catalogues. So in this example that you can see here, this is a configuration item catalog, and configuration item is a supertype of desktops, network elements, servers, and various other hardware devices. And so as you can see there in the second column of that catalog, it shows all those types. And in fact, this is essentially an abstract type, which means you don't directly create configuration items. So it's basically just a collection of different types. So it's very useful if you want to be able to see different element types that are related in the one catalog. Now in the catalog, you can show any property that belongs to the supertype, and the subtypes will have those properties inherited so they can have their own values for those things. And of course, I mentioned that type column that's there. That's a new thing for catalogs. You can show it in any catalog. It makes more sense to show it in a catalog that has inheritance, because otherwise everything will be of the same type, but it's available for any catalog where you desire. So let me jump out to ABACUS quickly and we'll have a better look at that. This is the ABACUS 5.2 example project. If you download the beta, you'll be able to look at that. And even if you're just using the latest ABACUS version, you'll see the relevant example project. It's included in the data folder of the installation directory. Or if you're using ABACUS Cloud, you'll find it under the home folder. And it's a great place to start looking at ABACUS if there's features you're not familiar with. Basically, you'll see this start screen when you open up the file. And there's links to different training videos and other places, as well as the different artifacts, some of which we'll look at today. So let's go ahead and have a look in our catalogs. We'll go to infrastructure. We'll look at configuration items. This is very similar to the screenshot that I just showed. Now the button here allows you to include or exclude the subtypes. So as I mentioned, this is essentially an abstract type, so there's no actual configuration items per se. There's only subtypes that are instances in our model. So if I turn that back on, you'll see all of those types. I can filter it down just like anything else in Catalogues. So I can see the types that are of interest to me. I can, of course, configure the columns in the catalogue any way that I like, just as I did before. But the big difference here is you do have an extra column here for the type. So you might decide we want to see that or we don't want to see it. And then, of course, this works with Publisher as well as Excel round tripping and Google Sheets round tripping. So if you're working with those, you can push it out. You can add multiple instances of different types into the catalog and import them back in. And it works seamlessly just as before. So it's a very powerful feature that has been requested quite a lot since we did the meta model inheritance. So we're very pleased to have that one in 5.2. Going to the next major feature, we can look at matrices. Matrices now support filtering by the connection content. And so what that means is if you have a large matrix and it has a lot of different rows and columns in it, but not many of them are populated with data, sometimes it can be very difficult to trawl through it and find what you're looking for. So we now have filters that will allow you to bring down to just show the columns and the rows that do have data. You can be specific and you can do just columns or just rows, or you can do both. It's in the matrix filters where you can configure that. So on the two tabs, you can set that up. If you do add a new connection into your model and the rows weren't shown previously, they will then cause the rows to automatically display in the matrix, so you don't have to worry about refreshing it. And of course, if you don't want to do that and you do want to be able to show all the rows, columns, you just disable the options. And that will allow you to easily create new connections through the matrix. So you can easily support that use case. I'll jump back to ABACUS quickly and we can start to look at that. You can do it with any matrix, whether it's a direct or an indirect matrix. So if we were to look at application independence, you see that we've got a number of connections there, but there's a few applications like our intranet that don't have any. So if I was to go into my filter, and we'll just do it on the start, which is the left-hand side here for now. So that will reduce us down. In this particular catalog, we were showing 12 rows before. Now you can see that there's only 5 showing, there's 5 that are hidden. It's only showing the rows that have data. I could do the same for the columns if I chose. And of course, these work in conjunction with any other filters that you'd like to have, whether it's a name or a property filter, or it might be by a standard that the component has assigned to it. Once again, that will reduce the matrix down. So going back to the features, we'll skip ahead to the next one. We can look at configurable catalog column names. So previously, obviously, you could configure a catalog to show any columns that you liked, but the names were using a standard format that we had. So certain things had pre-can names like hierarchy path or name. There were other things like properties, and it just showed the property name. And then for attached components, it had a special convention which showed something along the lines of incoming owns relationships from department components. So it was quite verbose and difficult for a lot of stakeholders to understand if they weren't familiar with the ABACUS model itself. So now we allow designer users to configure those column names as they appear above each column. If you hover the cursor over the top of the column, you can see a tooltip that will show you the actual ABACUS attribute name. So if you do change it to something that doesn't make much sense, then you can still find out what it is by hovering over. But generally, of course, you want to use a nice intuitive name, and sometimes keeping it simple is the best thing. So if you're working with users that aren't familiar with the Abacus model, you can spell out in plain English what it is that they're looking at. And this will all show up in the Excel and Google round tripping. So if you need to give a catalog to somebody else, you might even rename the columns to include some brief instructions. You might put in brackets what it is that the data is that you need to import and how they should provide it. So looking back at Abacus, we'll go back to our configuration items catalog. We're using all standard names here at the moment. We've changed this one actually. This one was traditionally hierarchy path, but we might decide that we want to change it again. So maybe we'll do Abacus repository location. And maybe the ID will be a little bit more specific. So what kind of ID is it? Well, it's our configuration ID. And as I mentioned, you round trip that out and that will show up in those other formats. If you do a publish and have a web portal that contains all of this, it will show up there as well. Back to the presentation, we've made a number of enhancements to the publisher module with Abacus. That's that feature I just mentioned that allows you to create web content that you can host in a web portal. And so with that, firstly, there's an extra option that allows you to include Excel links to catalogs and matrices that are published. And what that means is rather than just view the catalog or the matrix directly through the publisher portal, users now have the option to click on a link, and that link will download exactly what they see in Excel format. Traditionally, a lot of users wanted to see it in Excel, but they had to talk to the Abacus users to get it as an Excel catalog, especially if they wanted to make changes and send them to be reloaded back into Abacus. But now all they need to do is click on that link. It will give them the catalog, which they can then update, and that can easily be uploaded back into Abacus. Another major change that's been made to Publisher is that the options are now stored in the object model itself. So they're stored in the Abacus project. And so that means if you are automating your publish, you no longer have to change the config that's in the background. Instead, you just go into your Publisher options directly through the UI, and you can change the options that are there. The next time the publish takes place, it will pick up on those options and it will change the layout or the items that are displayed in your publish. That's especially useful for users that are using cloud. Traditionally, they had to talk to us if we were hosting what they had to make sure it was configured the way that they wanted. But now they can simply go and configure it themselves, and that will show up the next time the publish takes place. We've also improved support for BPMN 2 and ArchiMate 3. So ArchiMate 3 is a very new library for those familiar with it. It came out probably about 9 months ago. So we did have a library for it in our previous release, 5.1. I believe we were the first tool on the market to have a ArchiMate 3 library available. And now we also support the interchange format. So that hadn't been finalized when we produced the library, but in recent months it did get finalized, so that's now built into Abacus. And what that means is if you're using another ArchiMate tool and you have various artifacts, you can export those into the ArchiMate 3 XML format and then import those into Abacus. And not only will it bring in the content itself, it will bring in the diagrams. And because ArchiMate has the standardized notation, which is built into our library, the diagrams will look virtually identical to what you had in the other tool. The same goes for BPMN 2.0. We traditionally had an add-on script that you could get from us that would allow you to import, but it usually required a bit of configuration. But now we've tested it out well with various tools that have their own nuances to how they export that standard XML. and that can be imported directly to ABACUS. So if you do have another BPMN tool that you've used in the past, you can bring in your diagrams very quickly and easily to ABACUS. So they can either be brought in as a new project if you're starting from scratch, or if you need to import into an existing project that you have, simply right-click in the relevant part of the Explorer tree, and you'll see the option for Import from XML. And then you just point to the BPMN or the ArchiMate XML files, and the content will be brought across. Something else that is a very significant change in 5.2 is that you can now manage scripts that you might have across the project. So rather than have scripts distributed to individual users, you can have them belong inside the project itself. That's very useful when you have scripts that you want different stakeholders across the organization to use. A lot of organizations had troubles managing the versioning of that, and oftentimes they'd get around that by having a shared drive to make sure that everyone's using the latest scripts. But that's no longer necessary. You can just add them directly into your ABACUS script manager. You do need to be an admin user to add the scripts in, so not just any user can do that. And then any user will have access to the scripts that are there. With the project scripts, you do also have the ability to have multiple levels of groupings. So you don't have to have a flat list of scripts. You can have it hierarchically built up with as many levels of groupings as you like. So it's easy for people to be able to find the various scripts that they're looking for without trawling through a long list. And of course, if you do still have scripts that you just use personally and they're not things that are shared across other users on the organization, then you can install those on your computer or in your cloud instance and still run those locally without them belonging to the project. So if we go ahead and look in ABACUS, you'll find that all underneath the Tools menu. You can go to Manage Project Scripts, and you see I've already put a few test scripts in here. I put in a grouping. I can move things around as I see fit. I might like to add a new group. And maybe I'll drag things around or create a new script. With a new script, I can edit that directly from here, and that will open up in the script editor. Or I can also run the script from here, but more typically users are going to run them from the Tools menu itself. So the structure that you define there, where I had my new group and my new group 2, will be reserved over here, so it's very easy for people to access the scripts and use them as they like. And of course, if you do want to use personal scripts, there's just an extra menu item for that, and that will pop up and show any scripts that you have managed locally. Report Builder is something else that we've done a lot of work on for this release. Previously, if you loaded a report, it loaded in a separate window, and sometimes that popped up behind ABACUS, so you didn't always know that it was there. So what we've done now is we've loaded the reports into a panel inside ABACUS, just like a diagram or a chart or anything else that you have inside ABACUS. So it'll be a tabbed document. But otherwise, once that loads, functionally it's the same. You can save it to Excel, PDF, or Word. And of course, you can configure the report to appear how you like and have the content that you need. So it just makes it easier to keep all your reports easily sorted in one place as you view them. If you're an ABACUS Cloud user, you might be aware that you could edit reports locally on your computer, and that was how most people did it. But you had to use a shared drive to do that. We now allow you to do that directly through the browser. You can download the RDL report file through your browser, and then you can also upload it back through your browser. So it makes that process significantly easier. We've also updated the format that's used in reports. So previously we had the RDL 2012 format, but now we are supporting RDL 2016. That is backward compatible, so if you have reports already that are using 2012, they will still work perfectly fine. But if you want to take advantage of the extra features that are in 2016, you can do that as well. RDL is the Microsoft report definition language, so it is a standard that's used by most report editors, so it makes it very easy to edit your reports in any different any editor you might have that supports that format. There is also an extra option when you're editing the data sets, and that's essentially how you configure the report in Abacus, so you don't have to write any kind of SQL or querying like that. It's all graphically based. But this extra option will allow you to keep extra data sets that are added. So if you create a calculated field inside your report, you can keep that anytime that you update the data sets in Abacus. You don't have to go and re-add it. So that simplifies that process significantly. Now, there's been a lot of change in Abacus Intelligence, and I'll just touch on 5 of the improvements that are happening there. The first one being dynamic catalogues. Secondly, we have role-based permissions, and that's based off the same model that we have in the Abacus client. There's also support for single sign-on using ADFS, very similar to the single sign-on for cloud I just talked about before. You can also more easily edit charts that you have that are existing in your dashboards rather than having to create new ones. And there is support for direct Active Directory integration if ADFS isn't an option and you have direct access to your AD server. That's the best way to set up authentication, so users don't have to have extra passwords. So the first big improvement was the dynamic catalogues that are now present. So we of course had catalog before, portlets in there before, but now it's a much more interactive experience. The control's much richer, loads a lot faster. And one of the big things is that filters can apply to these catalogs. So if you click on a chart and it applies a filter, that filter will also get applied to the catalog. And also vice versa, if you apply a filter inside a catalog, it becomes a global filter. So that will apply to other charts in the dashboard. If you change dashboards, it will also apply to the other dashboards as well. There's also a much better search capability inside of the catalog. So you can search across pages. If the content is on a page that's not being currently shown, you can still find it. And it works much faster than it did with the previous catalog design. So let's jump over to Abacus Intelligence. I've got a dashboard here for applications. For those of you not familiar with Abacus Intelligence, it's essentially a dashboarding portal. It allows you to present information to different stakeholders. They can each have their own dashboards, and it's a very rich interactive experience. And so we've improved the catalogs to be more in line with the other portlets that we have. I'll apply the filter up here. And you'll see it worked that way. So if I put in the in-house filter into supplier, it applies as a global filter, and that reduces the number of items that appear in the pie chart down below. So it should work vice versa. If you're not familiar with Intelligence, we can give you a login to an example page as well, so that you can explore the different features that are in there and look at the various portlets. But it is a really good experience, especially for users that don't have access to the Abacus client. They can just log directly into this portal, find the information that they're looking for without having to dig for it, and then they'll be able to provide feedback to the Abacus community after viewing the information there. Something else that is in Intelligence now is role-based permissions. It's based off the same model that's in Abacus, and in fact you manage the users directly through the Abacus interface. So you go into your Abacus client, and where you manage users and groups, you now have an extra option that can allow you to set whether a user has Intelligence access, whether they should be a standard user or whether they should be an administrator. And once that's been committed back to your repository, that will be applied to your intelligence server. And when users log in, they're only going to be able to see data that they have access to. So if it's a user that can only see, say, the applications in North America and not elsewhere, then it will filter out any charts to only show the North American applications. Very similar to ABACUS Cloud, we now have the single sign-on capability for intelligence. The difference here is that you can host this on-premise, so it works fine either way. And what happens is users log into intelligence as before, but instead of providing their password to ABACUS, they provide it directly to their Active Directory or their third-party authentications environment. You can actually have it configured so there is no login screen either. So that's the way that you configure your environment. It's not to do with us, but you can either have it that it prompts for the user to provide their password, or it just takes them straight in. And so once the handshake takes place on the authentication environment, a token is passed back to ABACUS, and then the permissions of the user are stored in the ABACUS repository. So they're retrieved from there, and users are giving access to what they should have permissions for. Now, we do recommend this authentication option for organizations that require single sign-on, and they can't directly access their AD servers. So that's pretty typical. If you're hosting your intelligence environment with us, you wouldn't open up your AD servers to us completely. So being able to have that as an alternative works very well. In the intelligence dashboards, you can also more easily edit charts that are there. So you can change maybe the property that's being shown, or you might change the name of the chart. You just click on the question mark button in the toolbar of the portlet, and that will bring up the options for the chart. So you can change it as extensively or as minimally as you like. You might just change the default filters that are used, and then that will be applied to the chart. So you don't have to worry about recreating a chart. Just go back and edit the one that you've already got. Then, of course, there's the direct Active Directory integration. That uses LDAP. So if you've got an Active Directory server, all you need to do is provide the server host name and the base domain that you're using. With that, that will specify which users can log in, essentially, which ones will have permissions. And so it's a very simple way of setting up authentication that's tied in with your centralized authentication system without having to go to the extra effort of configuring single sign-on. We do recommend that for organizations that host intelligence on-premise. Now, of course, there's the updated libraries I mentioned at the beginning. We've updated BPMN 2.0, and part of that was to do with the way that the importer works. So it's a little bit more robust in some of the things that it has in it, and it will work very well with the XML format coming across. We now also have new frameworks. One is for the Australian Government Architecture Initiative. So as I mentioned, that's very similar to FIAF. And so if you're a FIAF user, that's well worth a look. And there's also the BizBoc model that we have in now, really good for business analysis. And both of those are included out of the box with ABACUS. So thanks very much for your time today. If you have any questions, I'll spend a few more minutes on the line, so feel free to pop them into the chat window. But ABACUS 5.2 will be available officially in the new year, but if you do want to get onto the beta program, please either email me, my address is there, or get in touch with your account manager, and we'll get you the details for that as soon as possible. If you are new to ABACUS, feel free to download a 30-day trial of ABACUS. You can do that directly through our website, evolutionsoftware.com. We can also provide trials for ABACUS Cloud if that's something that's going to be more in line with your needs. So let us know exactly how you'd like that deployed, and we can show you the best way, or rather we can make sure that's provisioned in the way that you need.